So we have, in a moment, we're going to invite Matt up and you're going to hear some of his story so you can get to know what actually is his heartbeat. But also, I just wanted to say that we believe, even though this is a little bit unusual and maybe not what we thought would be our next step, over the last 12 months that Matt's been here with us, at the start of this year, I had this group called Learning Community, which I do at my house. We just invite, I've only got six chairs, so there were 6 of us in this group. And Matt was part of that. And as we saw connections happening around the table over that period of summer and Learning Community and looking at discipleship, Matt was just asking questions that were so good. He's very good at asking questions. Get ready for that. And he was also tuning in to just what's happening in this region and also just commenting on some of the strategy that the Father seems to have for us. So there's a lot of layers there that we're just looking forward to seeing emerge as he steps into this role for the next 12 months. So would you welcome with me Matt Maudlin? He's been doing Uber driving last night, so if he falls asleep, it might be that he's asked lots of good questions and didn't get enough sleep. Let's welcome Mac very first. Sharing the story.
Good morning. It's good to be here. Slightly nervous, but I think that's a good thing. Shrug of the shoulders, I'm with you. Yeah, it's okay, you'll be all right. So when Di invited me to talk for about 20 minutes, which I took as being 55 minutes, I thought, how do I bring the key moments, the salient moments of nearly 55 years of life into a 20-minute talk? See how we go. Born in England, as my accent clearly betrays, in 1968. I'm the product of my dad, who became an Anglican priest in his early 50s, and of a mum whose father was an Anglican priest. So I was brought up in the Anglican church. I was born and bred in the famous horse racing town of Newmarket, which is just outside of Cambridge, famous of course for its university, and my very first love in life, Cambridge United Football Club. At the age of 5 years old, we were pretty poor growing up, and at the age of 5 years old, we had a very cold, big playroom, a cheap extension at the end of our house, at the back of our house. And you couldn't really use the playroom in the winter because we couldn't afford to heat it, and it was English winter, terribly cold. So we were able to use it for 2 or 3 weeks a year in the summer. No, maybe a bit more. When I was 5, I have this, still perhaps the sharpest memory of any memory that I have as a child. And in that playroom there was a big map of the world. And at that time, one of my mum's friends, Maureen, who she'd done teacher training with in London, and who had subsequently moved to Australia and become a missionary in PNG, she was visiting England on sabbatical. And she came to visit us in Newmarket, and I can remember standing in the playroom next to Maureen, looking at the map of the world, and she pointed out where England and Britain was, and then she pointed way down south where Australia was, and Esperance, where she was based at the time in WA, and she showed me PNG, where she'd been working with her husband. And something happened to me as a little boy of 5, where something about Australia kind of got into my heart and my mind, and I knew at 5 years old that Australia was to play a very significant part in my life. I'll come back to Maureen in a little bit. So I was brought up in the high Anglican church, bells, smells, candles, religious imagery, elaborate garments for the priests, and it was, as Rob knows, and I'm sure other people know, it was quite the spectacle. but it left me cold. What I observed of people in the Anglican Church and the church groups I grew up in was disharmony and anger and pettiness and petulance and frustration and recrimination and point scoring. And I knew early on that I didn't like it. But as much as I knew I didn't like it, I didn't know of an alternative. I didn't have an alternative. So I just accepted that that's church. That's the way it is. In many ways, I think I can describe my teenage years as being something of being a rebel without. I was pretty happy and settled in my teenage years as I grew up in Thatcherite Britain, and if I sound angry about that, I am. I threw myself into playing all manner of sports, particularly badminton, which has featured significantly in my life. And as I mentioned, following my first love, Cambridge United. School life was largely uneventful, with just the very occasional serious misdemeanour. I left school at 18 following my A-levels, something akin to Year 12 in Australia. I knew that I didn't want to go to university, so I made a brilliant decision to take a job in a children's bookstore, and I still look back on those 15 months with great fondness. That thing of being a little boy and 5 years old and knowing that Australia was to play a part in my life, this was the time I decided I'm going to Australia. I changed job, went to work, supermarket, night shift, doing stores, worked hard for a year, earned a ton of money, got enough money to head out to Australia. Now, my idea of my 1 year in Australia on my 1 year backpacker visa, which was akin to national service at the time for every young English person, my idea of my year in Australia was a year of just tremendous misbehaviour on every front imaginable. As you'll hear, it didn't quite work out like that. So I set out, August 1989, a very callow youth, to come to Australia. And I started my trip in Perth, and the people that I stayed with were Maureen, the lady that I'd stood next to as a 5-year-old, and her husband, Raymond. In the outer suburbs of Perth, they were the first people in my life that I'd come across who I'd heard them describe themselves as born-again Christians. That was quite an eye-opener for me, and the way they lived their life was quite eye-opening too. Growing up as I did in the church and in my family setting, we had a lot of icons, religious icons from Eastern Europe, portraying Jesus in all kinds of guises, I guess. And yeah, again, they left me cold, these things. But I guess for other people, my mum and dad included, they were items of beauty and significance. And I say that to say this. In Raymond and Maureen's house, they had this blue plaque, a little blue sign, about so big, so tall, and it was cheap, probably cost $3 or $4. It was no icon. And it simply said, Jesus is Lord. That's it. Jesus is Lord. And so to journey from my bedroom to the kitchen to the living room several times a day, I had to pass the piano on which the Jesus is Lord cheap plaque sat. And over a period of time, this cheap blue Jesus is Lord plaque started to haunt me. It was as though it had grown eyes. And I'd walk and it'd watch me, and I'd take a step back and it would follow me, and it's like, whoa. And I actually got a little bit worked up about it, to the point that I said to Maureen one night, what is it? What is this? Jesus is Lord. What does that mean? And I'm sure she'd been praying for this opportunity. And she took it, both barrels, of course she did, and I'm so very glad that she did. So she told me what she believed, that what it means, Jesus is Lord. And I think back to all the church that I'd done. Nobody had ever told me what it meant, that Jesus is Lord. So I said my first prayers, I started reading the Bible. Maureen gave me 1 or 2 books about journeying in the early part of faith. And I thought, this is great. This is really significant. I want this, but there was something holding me back, something that I wasn't prepared to go over the line at that point and make a commitment. Come back to that. I left Perth on my trip around Australia, and I ended up in Melbourne, in St Kilda, in horrible, horrible backpacker land, living in horrible, horrible apartments. It was grim. I started going to churches in the early part of 1990, every Sunday morning, trying to capture something of the essence that I felt that I'd experienced in Perth. But really, I just wanted someone to be nice to me. And I couldn't find it. Over many, many Sunday mornings of going to all manner of different churches, I invariably left, bought beer, went down to the Yarra and drank. It was a pretty miserable existence, and it wasn't the Australia dream that I'd hoped for. Then a rather wonderful thing happened. A fellow English backpacker, gentleman called Tim, came to live in our grotty apartment. And one night we got talking, and I told him about some of the experiences that I'd had, or felt that I'd had in Perth, of experiencing God, but questioning whether I really had, and perhaps I'd been duped and I'd been taken into somebody else's delusion. And Tim was very firm, and he said, "No, man, you've experienced God, but you need to get a body of faithful Christians around you who can support you and love you." I don't know what happened to that man, Tim, but man, I'm always grateful for him. And I think he was God's person to put into that grotty flat and say, "No, we're gonna find you a place, man." At that time, living in St Kilda, I had a friend who lived in Hawthorn. And one night I was going to visit my friend, and as I walked past Hawthorn West Baptist Church, as if by magic, somebody walked out of said Baptist church and said, "Would you like to come to church on Sunday?" And I said, "I very much would like to come to church on Sunday, thank you." Because remember, all I was looking for was somebody to be nice to me. And that's all it took. So, the following Sunday morning, Tim and I got up and we worked out how we were going to get to Hawthorn. And under normal circumstances, St Kilda to Hawthorn is one tram, one train. That morning, it took us 2 trams, 2 trains, and 2 taxis. Now, I don't necessarily go looking for demonic activity under every green bush, but man, there was something at play that morning. So we arrive about 20 minutes late, we walk into Hawthorn West Baptist Church, and I'm almost physically taken aback, because I can feel the presence of God. I can feel, tangibly, I can feel God's love in that room. I was blown away. The immediate problem that I had was that I felt that I'd stumbled into some kind of Jewish cult. And the reason being was that there was all this kind of dancing in the round going on, and all the women had headscarves and long hair, and a lot of the fellas had really long beards. Apparently that was just fashion for Australia in 1990, but I was thinking, wow, I've found God, but I've also found this kind of Jewish sect. Like, why can't it be easy? Anyway, quickly realised that it wasn't a Jewish sect. Well, maybe it was kind of, I don't know. And very quickly, the people of the church embraced me. Realised that here's a young man who's pretty lost, and he needs some love and he needs some care. And they provided that to me. I should also say that first morning, when the preacher preached, it was just like there was me and him, nobody else, because what he was saying was just going straight into the very core of my being. So a few weeks later, I made a commitment, just before Easter 1990, made a commitment to follow Christ. At the same time, I met the beguiling Isabel. I became part of a very tight-knit community in the Hawthorn area. I moved in with a family in the church. I grew in my walk with Jesus. And my 12-month visa was rapidly running out at the very time that I was the happiest I had ever been in my life. What to do? Well, 2 choices really. Who remembers back in 1990, and it seems odd now, when there were visa amnesties? you could go into hiding with your visa, if your visa had expired, and you could lay low for a bit until the government said, okay, all you visa amnesty people, come out now and we'll stamp your passport and you can stay. Seems odd now, doesn't it? Now they just throw you onto an island somewhere. So I talked with some of the wise heads at the church and I said, well, you know, perhaps I should just go into hiding. And they said, yeah, you could do that, Matt, but probably no. Probably go back to England and do the right thing, because if Australia's to play a big part in your future, you know, you want to do things right. Difficult at the time to leave the church, to leave Isabel, but it was the right thing to do. So of course I went home, and it was difficult. Once I got home, people saw change in me. People could not believe that I'd become, almost within the space of a year, a different human being. It was very encouraging. Isabel was doing a 12-month discipleship training school at church in Hawthorne at the time, and the very day that ended, she jumped on a plane, flew to London, and we'd planned to spend 3 weeks together working out what does the future look like. 3 weeks turned into 3 years, got married, had our first baby, Rosie, it's a great name, and then we came back to Australia early 1994. So I want to touch very briefly on the part of our church life between 94 and 2021. Now, 27 years, that's a long period of time, right? And we were part of Hawthorne West Baptist for all that time, and we were part of some really good times, and we were part of some really difficult times of struggle there. And I guess, isn't that true for anybody who's part of a community for that period of time? We lived in Hawthorne, our family grew, and Rosie became Rosie, Polly, Hamish and Noah. I want to talk a bit about my non-linear career. Oh, I know. That's good. So in terms of formal education, if you're sitting there thinking, I wonder what kind of education Matt's got behind him, I bet it's pretty impressive. Well, don't bet. I am gloriously, proudly uneducated. Somewhere in my distant past I did attain a diploma of frontline management, and which is really about as useful as a chocolate teapot. That said, I've always been very careful to never confuse academic achievement with intelligence. So perhaps the most useful qualification I ever secured was when I was working for a chemical company in Richmond in '94, and I gained a Victorian forklift driver's license. I know, and I loved doing that, I really did. That particular job was really significant for me. I was there for 4 years, and I learned heaps and heaps and heaps about how not to treat people. It was a real formative part of who I am today. At Hawthorne West Baptist, there was, and indeed is, a not-for-profit arm called Servants Community Housing. And in 1994, they ran a fantastic community rooming house for 37 guys and girls at risk of homelessness. The model was very good. On-site management, meals provided, policies around no drugs, no violence, no alcohol. And if residents could not or would not abide by these very simple rules, they were put back into homelessness. And I appreciate that that sounds draconian, but when you're operating houses of up to 37 people, people with complex needs, you need to have strong, actionable rules with strong, actionable consequences. So typically this house, it was run by well-intentioned couples from the church. They would move on site for a couple of years. They would be out their depth with the issues that were there. They burned out very quickly and they left the role. But very sadly, when they left the role, they didn't just leave the role, they left the church as well. Why? Because they didn't, and they were not supported. So, me and Isabel, we took the job of manager there in 1998. And we probably should have been the next in line to be out of our depth, burn out, leave after 2 years, get disenfranchised with the church, leave the church. But we didn't. We loved it. At the time that we moved in, Rosie was 4, Polly was 3. We'd been there just a few days, and one day we were in one of the kitchens and we were cleaning tiles. And it suddenly struck me for the first time in my life, I'm born for this. Not born to clean tiles in a kitchen, I mean, I can do that too. But I'm born to work with this group of guys, and I use guys as guys and girls together. Born to work with the disenfranchised and the vulnerable and the hurting. And thus began an incredible 20-year career for me at Servants Community Housing. I loved it. I loved working with the residents, bringing them respect and dignity and hope, and hopefully a future. And working with servants, I saw the very best and the very worst of human nature. I witnessed incredible generosity, and Jeff, I know you'll know some of these things. When you see somebody who has nothing give away their last cigarette, you think, wow, would I be prepared to do that? Maybe, maybe not. But we also witnessed people's deep traumas, and I experienced and endured violence. I watched people die in front of my eyes. And I saw dignity restored to people in front of my eyes too, and that was so special. Simply put, those 20 years at Servants were the making of me. 5 years into my Servants journey, I became CEO, and that's when the fun really started. In the years that followed, we grew Servants from one house with 37 residents to 4 houses with nearly 100 residents. And we did some cool projects. Our houses are in Hawthorne and Kew, and if you know Hawthorne and Kew, you know that they're absolutely surrounded, inundated, infected by private schools. And I stumbled upon this brilliant idea that where our houses were often 2-3 kilometres as the crow flies from these private schools. And I wanted to tell the stories of our residents, because their stories are worth telling, because they're people who have been busted up, but they're still precious people. And I approached one of the private schools, Scotch, and I said, I want to write a book about my residents, and I want 2 of your students to write it. I expected to be, slapped around and told to get off the premises quickly, and they said, yeah, let's do it. So we wrote a book, and it was good. The year after we wrote a book, we wrote another book, and we invited 4 schools in. And with these books, we printed them to give them away. And over several print runs, we created over 30,000 books that we gave away to tell stories of our residents. And from there we created theatre. I went back to Scotch and said, books are good, let's do a piece of theatre. Let's have your high school students telling the stories of my residents. It was disarming. Students loved it. A couple of the students were so impacted by this project that I had to go and talk to Scotch and say, I'm worried that their parents are going to come up with a pitchfork, because this is not what they're paying $35,000 a year for, to have their sons move into community work, not become a doctor. And the school was brilliant, and they said, if that happens, it's a great problem to have and we'll deal with it. The first piece of theatre was picked up by a professional theatre company who then matured it, I guess, and taught it, and it was brilliant. And then we did another piece of theatre, asking our residents, what does home mean to you? And from that, another exciting project grew. It was great. Whenever I used to talk about servants, I always used to say, I have 5 children, 4 of my own, and Servants Community Housing. That's how kind of entrenched I was in it. I thought it was my forever job. And then one Friday evening in December, just before Christmas, December 2016, I was following Melbourne Victory pretty hard at that time. And it was a hot Friday night, and Melbourne were playing Perth at the Rectangular Stadium, and it was a dog of a game. It was horrible. And it was 0-0, and in the second half, I came onto my phone. And it was about work, and it wasn't a particularly good email, but it wasn't the worst email of all time either. But I looked at the email and I just knew I was done. I wasn't going to deal with what was in the email. It was as clear as Rob is sitting in front of me now. And I had this incredibly anguished weekend of, is this right, God? Are you really pulling me out as servants after all we've done together and we've done with the community and the way the lives of our residents are progressing? Is this really the moment that I've got to step over this line? It was the kind of thing that happens to other people or happens in a movie, but you feel doesn't happen to you, and here it was happening to me. And I knew that I was done. So I went in at 7 o'clock on the Monday morning. So this is just before Christmas 2016. And I wrote out my notice of resignation. And I went from, I guess, highly respected CEO of really strong community housing organisation, well respected, well paid. I went from that to unemployed by choice. And of course, I've got my wife and my kids looking at me like, are you sure, Dad? But yeah, I was sure. I was absolutely sure. And it was painful to walk away. But as per usual, Father knows best, yeah? I took a few months to breathe, to sleep, to smell the roses, to ponder. I created a brand new community housing theory that I still believe is brilliant, and I have shared with one or two of you in the room at that time. And I waited to see what Father had next, because I was fairly sure there was an adventure or two in the old dog yet. Then it happened. In April 2017, two not-for-profit organisations that I'd never previously heard of, but fortunately they'd heard of me, they came looking for me. Myeloma is a blood cancer. It's an incurable blood cancer. I'm sure there's people in the room who've been affected by myeloma one way or another. Myeloma Australia came to me and said, we want to employ you. We don't know what we want you to do. Are you happy to be employed by us? Yep. You're happy to pay me. So they said, have a look around and tell us what you can do. So I had a look around and I said, you need to get a serious fundraising arm going. So they then employed me in this fantastically elaborate title of National Community Engagement and Fundraising Manager. The title was this. It was fantastic. And I was there for 6 months, and I only finished there 18 months ago. I worked there 3 to 4 days a week. And Myeloma Australia, at the time I started, was a very broken organisation. By the time I finished, it remained a very broken organisation. But I absolutely loved it. And I loved having a territory of Australia where I could create community with the myeloma community. People who, let's call a spade, were dying. At that same time, that's when Pong came knocking on my door, and Pong asked me whether I could do a few hours strategy work for them a week, and the rest is history there, of course, and I'm still at Pong. So the interesting thing for me in leaving servants was that as I reflected on my servants' days, I kind of accepted that you've had 20 amazing years, 20 years that you've loved, 20 years where God's been able to use the way that he's built me, I guess, to serve other people well. And I'm probably never going to find anything that floats my boat quite like those servants' years did. And I was okay with that, because maybe for a lot of us, we don't have 20 years in our career that we look back on with such fondness and just know that it was gold. But again, God knows what he's doing, right? And now I find myself at Pong, possibly more in love with the work I do in Pong than I ever was at Servants. That's special. So I stand before you today as something of a representation of the gig economy. Now here I am doing 1.5 days a week with us. I do a couple of days a week for the Pong. I coach badminton professionally a few hours a week in terms 4 and 1 at Wesley College. And then in my spare time, I drive Uber. And I got to tell you, I love driving Uber. Now, I am the self-proclaimed world's greatest Uber driver. But here's the thing, many of my 1,500 rides across the last 12 months would also attest to that. I love meeting people, and I love hearing people's stories. And often on an Uber ride, it's 2 minutes to an hour and 2 minutes. Sometimes you can go deep real quick. Sometimes you have a bit more time to go deep. But it's a wonderful thing. Hopefully, on occasions, I can talk some wisdom and sense into some of the broken lives, broken stories that I hear. I think I can say that whatever else happens in my life, whatever other adventures occur, I think I'll always drive Uber. I'll always have it as a part of what I do, because not all ministry occurs within the four walls of a church building, right? So, Isabel, my wife, myself, and our youngest, Noah, we moved to Sylvan 2 years ago, August 21. And it wasn't until about 12 months ago that I set foot in here. So in July of last year, I was on a Pong road trip in New South Wales, and two things happened that kind of nudged me here. One, I was talking with a member of the Pong community who was part of one of the Sydney Vineyard Church. Is it Northridge? Ridge? Yeah, he was part of Northridge, and I was telling him we'd moved to the Yarra Valley and we'd moved to Sylvan, and he said, "Oh, Sylvan, that's right next door to Mount Evelyn, and Yarra Valley Vineyard meets at Mex." He said, "Maybe you should check it out." And something just went on at that moment. A couple of days later, I met a pastor for the first time who was interested in his church community getting involved in Pong. And we got on real well. And the day after I met him, he sent me this email, and it was like, platitude, 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 love you, love Pong. But he said, "I was really sad to hear that you're not part of a church community, a church family, a place where you can serve and be served. And my encouragement and my prayer is that you'll really consider finding a place." I thought, okay, that's pretty ballsy, isn't it, to say to somebody, but I really appreciated it, and I let him know that I appreciated it. So the following Sunday, based on those two little nudges, I walked in here. I think I quickly understood within just a matter of weeks that this is where Father wants me to be. And on occasions, I've been asked a question from people here, like, how'd you find it, Matt? Do you like the worship? Does it suit all your needs? And there's nothing wrong with the question per se, but my understanding is that if this is where Father wants me to be and to serve and be served, then all the other things are almost peripheral. And I do believe that he wants me here. And perhaps today we're starting to see the part of the reason for that. So I'm just happy to be here. So I think I met Di on my first Sunday. I walked in and she bowled up to me and said, "Who are you?" or something like that. Yeah. Whoa, that's pretty forward. Anyway, a few weeks later, Di and I had coffee for the first time, and I was driving over to that coffee meeting, and I just had this really strong sense that I had to just spit out my life to Di over coffee. So we sat down and I said, "Di, this is kind of a bit unusual, but I think I need to tell you everything. A synthesized version, but the good, the bad and the ugly." And Di very graciously said, "Sure, if that's what you think you need to do." I don't know what it sounded like, Di, but it came out. And maybe that was the start of where we are today. And then a few months ago, Di mentioned to me that the church was thinking about a community engagement type of position, and I thought, it sounds interesting, tell me more. And we talked more and prayed and reflected, and then we got Rob involved and we talked more, and then the rest of the elders involved and we talked a bit more. And then a couple of weeks ago, Di offered me the opportunity to take this position up, which I'm absolutely thrilled to do. So I thought, what do people of the church family here, what do they want to know about me? So I've made a list. So what are you getting with Matt? I guess only time will tell, right? It's like I can't and I'm not going to answer that. So the first thing I thought was, what you're getting with Matt, you're getting someone who, like everybody in this room, in so many ways is broken and busted up, and has had disappointments, and has had embarrassing and shameful things happen to them, and who is absolutely reliant and dependent upon God for his grace and his love and his mercy to even have got through to this point, to be standing here before you at nearly 55 years of age. And I think it's true for everybody in the room. I also think with Matt that you have somebody who, metaphorically, you would want next to you in the trenches. I'm not afraid to stick my neck out for the vulnerable. I'm not afraid to be unpopular with unpopular opinions. I think with Matt what you see is what you get, the good, the bad, and the painful. I think with me you have someone who loves God, who wants to hear from him, and who wants to do the things that he is calling me and us to. I think and I hope that you have somebody that you can confide in and that you can trust. I think you have someone who possesses a simple godly wisdom. I think you have somebody that you can certainly laugh with. And you have somebody who is comfortable both celebrating and mourning alike. You have somebody who wants to hear your story, and you have somebody who wants to see you flourish in all the things that Father undoubtedly has for you. So I've got to know a few people here at YVV quite well across the past 12 months. And there's a few more folks who I'm getting to know on a slightly deeper level. And there's still more folks that I'm slowly starting to get on first name terms with. There's many people now that I recognise and I'm starting to get on nodding terms with. It's a process, isn't it? And I'm keen to get to know everybody here, and hopefully quickly too. So do please either expect a call or an email from me, or better still, reach out to me. In talking with Di and Rob of late, one of the things I've been talking about is building a YBV family tree. I really need to understand the family tree of who's in this room, who's who in the zoo, who fits in where. Because I don't have a great understanding of that at the moment. And if you can help me with that, I'd really welcome it. I think a part of this role is to operate under Di and the elders and to serve them as best as I am able. And it's also about listening to Father, bringing his kingdom here on earth, whatever that might look like, however that might be. With me, everything's all about talking and coffees, and dreaming and ideating and plotting and planning and having adventures together and growing and maturing and developing community, inviting others in. It's all about being his people. Perhaps you're sitting here this morning, perhaps you're sitting on an absolutely genius idea. I'm sure you are. Something God's put on your heart. And perhaps you're a little too shy or embarrassed or something to talk to anybody about it. I'd love to hear that story, that thought, that genius idea. Let's see what God might have in mind for that idea. This is the stuff that excites me. So, one or two things, as I reach the end, a few things about me personally. Been married to Isabel for 32 years. Some of you have met Isabel. Isabel is a complex character, and I certainly very much hope that many more of you come to know Isabel in the months and years ahead. We have 4 kids, aged between 29 and 14, and we have 2 cats and 2 dogs. I love reading. I read all sorts of things, but my favourite things to read are baseball books, especially baseball that deals with the Negro Leagues and minor league baseball history. I like most sports, but especially baseball, badminton, soccer, AFL and cricket. My musical tastes are wide and varied, and on occasions perhaps a little surprising, but I'm not going into that here. You'll have to ask me about that one. I taught myself to play saxophone to a reasonable standard, and I love movies. Sometimes I kid myself that I'm a runner. I'm not really, but I do have to say that one Sunday morning in February I did run a half marathon before coming to worship. That was a grim morning because I was too sore to sit down and I was too sore to stand up. All I really wanted to do was be in bed. One of my major goals for 2023 is to run a full marathon. I'm not sure that's going to occur. It might have to become a 2024 goal. I'm the chairperson of Holy Fools Incorporated, and I'm sure some of you here know of Neil Taylor and the good work that is done at Holy Fools, and it's a privilege to serve in that way. And in fact, that word, serving, that's probably the key word to me in my life. I want to serve. I want to be involved in the things that Father has me as an individual and for us as his body to be involved in. I know that God's blessed me with some talents and abilities to use for these purposes. I believe that God's called me to this role, and I certainly, 2 things. One, I wouldn't have accepted the position unless I believed that God was in this. And 2, I wouldn't have expected Di with the elders to have offered me the position if God wasn't in this. So I'm so looking forward to getting to know you all, to building this YVV family tree together, and starting to understand what it is that we might be able to bring to fruition together. My hope is very much that in 12 months' time, at the conclusion of this position, that we'll collectively be able to say that God was seen, God was at work in how Matt served the YVV family. Thank you.